me say good evening and welcome you to the Through the Revolving Door forum. I'm Bill Kovich, curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalists here at Harvard, and I have been asked to try to referee this group tonight. The subject is one that is traditionally of interest to a group of journalists, but increasingly now, as the public becomes more and more concerned about the quality of their political information, public affairs information, it has become a subject of concern to consumers of news in great number. Like Alice stepping through the looking glass, the world in which journalists become policymakers and policymakers become journalists can become disconcerting, if not for the actors, then at least for the audience. There are celebrated cases like George Will, who is going to be a visiting professor at Harvard in the government department next year, who in the 1980 campaign served as an advisor to Ronald Reagan prior to his debate with Jimmy Carter, and subsequently wrote a column in which he declared Ronald Reagan the victor in the debate and forgot to remind viewers that he had been involved and had an advocacy position. Or the cases in '88 of Bob Beckel and Haley Barbour, two advisors to the contending political parties for the presidency, also held television credentials and regularly were on television providing journalistic observations on campaigns that they were also privately advising. As Tara Murphy, who conceived this panel tonight, wondered whether it's a coincidence that the press and politicians are currently both held in low esteem, or is this crisis of confidence somehow related to the perception that the press and government officials are all in this together? Who, for example, is the politician and who's the journalist when John Sununu and Pat Buchanan and Michael Kinsley shout at each other on CNN? What values drive which participant at any given moment? The list could go on, but in about 10 minutes I came up with 28 names, not counting those I've just mentioned or those who are on the platform here tonight who have passed through the revolving door, ranging from people like John Siegenthaler, who served for 2 years as Bobby Kennedy's administrative assistant and then walked away from government, back to journalism, and was eventually elected president of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, to David Gergen, whose career thread looks like the backlash on a fishing reel, and it's hard to tell where the thread begins and where it ends. At the most basic level, I think we're talking about how information about public affairs is used. Jody Powell has said that the two sides, the political side and the journalism side, are in fundamental conflict because journalists and politicians both deal with information, but for different reasons. Politicians use it to lead, journalists use it to inform. Politicians are seeking to direct an audience toward a predetermined conclusion or action, but journalists are seeking to offer alternative views and to encourage questions. My experience says that's essentially true, but to use a frame of reference that's in vogue these days in forum discussions, is it a matter of nature or nurture? Can a journalist find anything of value in public service? Can a politician ever be trusted to report the news? To start the discussion tonight, I want to pose a question to each of our panelists. But let me introduce them now before we start the conversation. We're lucky to have a wealth of experience here tonight to engage this issue, and I hope in a conversation with the audience here. To your far left is Mickey Edwards. You know him as a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School of Government. a member of Congress from Oklahoma for 16 years, where he served as chair of the House Republican Policy Committee, member of the Appropriations Committee, member of the House Budget Committee. He was chair of the Republican Task Force on Central America and authored the amendment which provided military assistance to the Contras in Nicaragua. He served 5 years as national chairman of the American Conservative Union and is one of the founding trustees of the Heritage Foundation. His journalism career began long before his political career. He has a degree in journalism from the University of Oklahoma, worked as a newspaper reporter and editor, and finally as managing editor of the paper in Oklahoma City. Is that right, managing editor?
Not quite.
I just promoted him?
Yeah, but I appreciate it. I might have still been there if they'd promoted me like that.
Long-form journalist as well. He's written 2 books, one on hazardous waste and one on the process in Congress, proposing a bold new politics for the 1980s. I think someone was listening. His articles, now that he's out of Congress, appear regularly in major newspapers. He writes a syndicated column. He appears on National Public Radio as a commentator, as well as a number of public affairs television programs. Here on my immediate right is Les Gelb, who accounts for one of my brushes with the revolving door when I was Washington Bureau Chief of the New York Times. I tried to keep the Times from hiring him to come into work in the Bureau. He eventually convinced me I was wrong, and he did. President of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, Les has had distinguished careers on both sides. His most recent journalistic career from 1981 to 1991 moved from national security correspondent based in Washington up through deputy editorial page editor of the New York Times and finally foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times, a job he left in '93 to move to his present position. Before that, he was an assistant secretary of defense involved in arms control issues. And before that, he was a diplomatic correspondent at the New York Times. And before that, he was in the Defense Department and part of the team that compiled what's now known as the Pentagon Papers, what was then known as the McNamara Report on the war in Vietnam. Also the author of several books on Vietnam policy, on foreign policy in general, advisory board member on the Center for Press, Politics, and Public Policy next door. And I think maybe the proudest achievement of Les Gelb was in 1993, he was named Father of the Year. On my immediate left, Marjorie Margolis Mezvinsky, who may have the most interesting current assignment right now. She is the director of the United States delegation to the United Nations 4th World Conference on Women to be held in Beijing, and that is going to be a full-time job. Marjorie was U.S. representative from the 13th Congressional District in the 103rd Congress, the first woman ever elected in her own right to the U.S. House to represent Pennsylvania. She served on the Energy and Commerce Committee and on the Subcommittee of Oversight, Investigations, and Telecommunications and Finance. She is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania and had a distinguished career in journalism, began as a television journalist at WCAU TV in Philadelphia, and from 71 to 91 as an NBC correspondent in various levels of moving up the chain in the NBC network television system. She worked in New York City and Washington as a contributing correspondent to The Today Show, Sunday Today, CNBC, and Real Life with Jane Pauley, work that won 5 Emmys as well as other awards. After her series on Southeast Asian orphans, and I'm sorry to say unaware of this till I saw your bio, and this is a striking piece of personal history. Marjorie became the first unmarried U.S. citizen to adopt a foreign child when she adopted a child from Korea. The chronicle of that experience led to a best-selling book, They Came to Stay, the first of 4 books she's written. She's married to Congressman Edward Mezvinsky, and the two of them have a combined family of 11 children, and refugee families they are sponsoring since their marriage. Their household has taken care of 25 children. And finally, last but not least, John Masic, on my far left, the political correspondent for the Boston Globe, has been a journalist for nearly 4 decades, but he qualifies for a position on this panel because he had a 4.5-month lapse. He lost his perspective for 4.5 months in the early 1960s when he was in the Dallas Morning News Washington Bureau and agreed to go into the Justice Department and work for Bobby Kennedy for 4.5 months before he came to his senses and decided his life really was journalism. And he came back out and went to work for U.S. News and World Report to open the Southwest Bureau for that magazine in Texas before he came back to Washington to cover the White House and to serve as political editor for U.S. News and World Report. He left that publication to assume the position of national correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution when I was editor of that paper, and was the mainstay of our political report for 2 years. John has covered every national political campaign since 1968 and is currently involved in planning and will be involved in the coverage of this campaign for the Boston Globe. The question I would like to begin the conversation with, and Mickey, if you will pick up on this, and then we can move around the panel here, and I would like each of you to think about a response to the same question. And rather than load it from the journalistic side or from the side of the policymaker, I'd like to keep it as neutral as possible so you can take it in any direction you want to. But the question is, does the revolving door benefit the consumer of the information or the people? Do more inside views on government demystify the policy process for the people, or does it make the electorate more cynical because they don't know where journalism ends and spin begins?
I can't think of very many ways to make them more cynical than they are now. Actually, I wore my Mickey Mouse tie today because that's sort of what journalists think of politicians and what politicians think of journalists, and I thought it somehow seemed appropriate. I'm thinking about this, and first of all, I don't find it at all unusual or striking that you find a long list. You said you came up with quite a few off the top of your head, a long list of people who serve in both journalism and politics, because it's the same part of the psyche, the same part of the interest that brings people either into politics or into the press. It's a very great interest in public affairs, and to a large extent, they are merely two avenues to engage in public affairs. And so it's probably not strange that there's a lot of crossover. But is it good or bad? First of all, I think that you have to make a distinction between who is a journalist and who is not a journalist. I, at one time, was a journalist. I'm not sure that I would classify myself as that. Today, I write newspaper columns for papers like the Herald and the Chicago Tribune and others, and do radio commentary, but they are clearly opinion pieces. on the editorial page are all things considered. They're presented as opinion. The people who are listening to those know that it's opinion. And it's the same thing with people who do columns or write editorials and who are not expected to be presenting objective reports of the news. I think the public doesn't get quite as confused about this as we might think. I think they're able to draw a line between who has a point of view, and in that case politicians and George Will and people who write on the editorial page of the Globe are all in the category of opinion purveyors as opposed to news purveyors. I think where you might have a problem is when you have people who are purporting to be objectively reporting factually on what is happening and who in fact clearly have an identifiable agenda of their own as identified by a career in politics. But I'm not sure that that is, while that may be a downside, I'm not sure that it's entirely bad, because I personally found that there was some benefit to having reporters who, instead of coming to the political process with cynicism and suspicion and a very great lack of knowledge of the process, if you had people who really understood the process, understand how it works, who don't think that there's secret deals lurking behind every door, but know how to really root out what is going on and who's talking to who and what's emerging from the process, I think that does a better job of conveying accurate information to the public. So I'm not terribly bothered, actually, by the idea of having people move back and forth between the two professions. I don't think it's overall a negative.
Les, do you agree that purveyors of opinion as opposed to fact reporters are judged by different values in this sense?
I don't think that the general public makes much of a distinction. They see somebody on the tube on a show that's described as a news show, even though we would call it an opinion show. I think most people would say it's a news program. They should say it's entertainment, or they shouldn't. But I don't think they make these distinctions the way we do. And when you have John Sununu, et cetera, talking about what they think, a lot of people think it's reality, not just their opinion. But can I go back to the question? I don't belong on this panel, Bill. I didn't revolve, I just kind of rotated occasionally here and there. And I wasn't a pol, I was a policy wonk, which is a subspecies of this conversation, or a subspecies of this conversation. But I was a policy wonk. I got a PhD from the government department here, was in all sorts of think tanks for a good deal of my life, and policy wonked in think tanks in universities, and policy wonked in government, and policy wonked in the New York Times, which I think is different from being a pol, who has a strong party affiliation, and you have a song to sing. And it really is somewhat different. And I think the problem that we're talking about is vastly different today than when Bill Kovach took me out to dinner after the first time I left the Times, and when I was talking about coming back, Bill Kovach took me out to dinner and said, hell no, we don't want this revolving door going on. Now, that was a minor problem compared to what you have today. Sununu or Dave Gergen, even some very capable people like Tim Russert. And, you know, I don't know which is more of a problem. I don't know if that's more of a problem than a journalist having friends in government. To me, the big problem was not my going in and out, as I think Bill will attest. I did my business in each place. The problem for me, and a problem for a lot of people in Washington who are in journalism, is that the social and personal lines between journalists and officials now has almost totally crumbled. And whether or not you go in and out of government and serve with someone, You become friends with them in ways that make it very difficult for you as a journalist to report on them, because you either find yourself being too hard by way of overcompensating, or too soft because you don't want them to, you don't want to spoil 20-year friendship. One of the things I always admired about Bill, which is almost totally untrue of Washington journalists today, is he kept a line, personal line, between himself and officials. But now, and I would say for the last 20 years in Washington, that's become every bit as big of a problem as what we're talking about here tonight.
Marjorie, before I ask you to answer the question, let me ask you something that occurred to me a number of times when we were working together, and I think I know the answer, but I've never asked it directly in this way. The journalist usually takes the position, if the journalist is doing the job right, that the role of the journalist is to disclose information and not to censor themselves based on what the implications that may be for public policy. The public judges that. As a policy maker who then became a journalist, did you at times allow your understanding of the impact of what you were about to write on policy edit your copy for you?
I don't think so. And we had a very close working relationship. If there was a tough story, I would always come in and tell you exactly what happened in the reporting. So I don't think I was editing myself in that way. What I think was working inside of me was, after having been in Washington for all those years and worked with people in different capacities, I was juggling personal relations rather than political impacts. Marjorie?
Your experience is a little different. Your long career in television did not entirely mesh the same way Mickey's did. In elective office, it was a little different. But did you find your years in Congress influenced by your background in journalism, and did it shape your approach to decisions on policy issues or legislative issues?
Yes and no. I learned, I started to dislike myself a lot. Me, the journalist, as opposed to me, the politician. I mean, I looked. It's interesting to go from one to the other. What you learn is fascinating. Just with regard to housekeeping, it's not necessarily that it's different. I mean, it's not better or worse. It's something that's different than what I thought it was going to be. I stood for so many hours outside of rooms, creating a picture for myself of what was going to be inside. And once I got there, it was quite different and very difficult not to. I mean, I was sitting on top of so many great stories, knowing very well that I could not share. And I mean, and in the beginning, because a lot of the women were followed around with television cameras, we would sometimes be wearing a mic. Well, my mic it was assumed it was something that was lethal or mischievous. But what I found, I mean, with regard to the larger picture, and then I'll get back to my personal experience, was that I think we've created an electorate that doesn't much understand the difference. I think we tell people what they want to hear, not what they need to hear. And having seen it from both sides, you can see how this happens. What's the definition of a leader? I mean, is it somebody who just listens to his or her constituents and then determines what he or she is going to say? That's to a great extent what we're seeing today. Where it comes from, I think, is ill-defined. But I think that a lot of the problems that we see come from people saying the things that we hear on talk radio with the kind of authority that makes people think that that is really true, when it isn't, or it's part of the truth. I mean, I was just listening to one of the talk radio guys the other day who said how incredibly rich the 80s were for business and the like, and how really well we did. Never finishing the sentence, we also shot $3 trillion into the debt. For those people who don't understand that, it comes as fact, and I think that we have to guard against that. For me, going from being a reporter to being, first of all, I couldn't stop writing. I sat there with texts, and I was still taking notes. I would sit in a State of the Union address, and I say, "Why am I writing this down?" I not only had the text, I could get the tape. But there was something about wanting to and I can remember after I lost, and there was a meeting of the losers at the White House, and we were all sitting around the table, and I couldn't help but take copious notes, because I knew that this was something that was so unusual. I mean, to be in there, and also to be somebody who's essentially a scribe. When I first got to Congress, I knew, because it was the year of the woman, which you will make note of, lasted for 365 days, that I wanted to get the women together to make a statement, because that's what I thought people wanted to hear. I thought that they needed to hear something from the women, mainly because everyone thinks, my favorite letter from a kid was, "Yours till Congress agrees." He signed it. "Yours till Congress agrees, Matthew." But the operative feeling is, those guys are never going to agree on anything down there, and now we have women. They're never going to agree. So I figured if we got together very quickly and came together, as we did, on 4 items that we made ours, that we put on our plate, it would at least be a signal that we could work together, and we did. But it was my being a journalist, and it was very important that I learned how to leave that behind, which I did, slowly but surely. I think that I could never go back to what I was doing. I think that I must now be, obviously, defined as someone who is a bit partisan. And I think that it would be very wrong for me to even try to go back to doing what I did before. But what did happen when I was there was, as a journalist, I was looking at both sides of the issue. I mean, you have to be certifiable in Congress to look at both sides of the issue. It's this kind of, you what? It was the debater and the journalist in me that wanted to see both sides. But it was really fun after a period to have an opinion. But I do not think that I should or would I ever go back to reporting the news, because I think I clearly come with too much baggage now.
Do you see a difference between, as Les does, between a policymaker and an elected official in that sense?
I think that's less clear. Is that what you want me to say, Les?
More clear.
No, I think that as Vicki said before, and I agree with him, that so much of it is fungible. So much of it does translate from one field to the other. It isn't bad when you have someone who has done a little bit of the politicking, understands it more. I was stunned, by the way, by how much time it took up. I mean, having been on the other side as a reporter, I knew that I wanted to get the story, and I had to go and ask these questions and everything, but especially for the things that we think are silly, and there are lots of those stories. The amount of time that it takes away from what you should be doing is really quite astonishing. But I think that going back and forth, once you've defined that you can no longer cover that story, because you know where you come from, people know where you come from, but that you can be a commentator on it, it's different. Now, I think, but that thrusts a huge responsibility on the public, I think. That is, to figure out what is a commentator, as Les was saying before, and what is a journalist.
John, you get to ramp this phase of the conversation up. You were in long enough to carry out a sense of how the system worked from inside, which is bound to be valuable to a journalist that covers the system. But were you in long enough to confuse your status?
Well, Bill, I don't think I was in long enough to confuse my status, but I feel like the skunk at the lawn party here tonight, because I am going to take exception to a few of the things that I've just heard. But I ought to start by, some people have come to this forum thinking that Kathy Bushkin was going to be here. I'm obviously not Kathy Bushkin. She's a friend and a colleague and administrative editor of U.S. News and former spokesman for Gary Hart in the 1984 campaign. And a couple of points that Kathy would make if she were here that I think I ought to pass on. She says that there are real purposes to be served by journalists and government officials seeing the other side, to the question Bill asked. It makes journalists smarter and more understanding of the people they cover. It gives government officials an appreciation for the role of the press in our system and should make them better about making information available. I dispute that, but that is Kathy's point. She said there are problems with those who go through the revolving door, not at the start of their career, but at the peak of it. And that's a very different thing from a person who's been a press secretary who wants to be a journalist, or a journalist who's seeking an agency job somewhere. And finally, she said that she is most troubled, and this point has been touched on, with the so-called pundits who are not journalists at all. I cringe when I hear John Sununu's name being mentioned as a journalist. I mean, he despises journalists, and he let that fact be known over and over and over. He's a performer, along with Pat Buchanan and Michael Kingsley, so you have both spectrums who shout at each other. And I think that as they are seen on the air, this is Kathy's point, she disputes that it gives them the right to comment as analysts when they actually are more partisan than party folks are themselves. Back when I started at the Dallas Morning News more years ago than I want to remember, and started covering politics, a crusty city editor that I worked for must have seen I had a pretty gregarious personality covering these folks, and politicians were hiring reporters for about 2 or 3 times their salaries. They didn't pay much in Texas in those days, and the city editor took me out for coffee one day and gave me a big warning. He said, I think you like your job, I just want you to know that around here you can't cover the circus if you're going to play with the elephants. Actually, his words were a little saltier than that, but I'm cleaning it up for a family audience. And the Dallas paper, and I think to this day does have that rule, I can't vouch for it, that once you left, you weren't coming back. I frankly believe that over time, newspapers and television stations, networks have lowered the bar quite a bit on rules of people who can come in and can't. Mickey and Les said, well, the public really is probably unaware whether Les Gelb, who is certainly a professional, ever was in policy or not. Well, unfortunately, the people you work for know that, though, and I think that that can be a real debilitating factor. When Diane Sawyer came straight off Richard Nixon's staff and helping write the Nixon memoirs, and went to work for CBS, it caused a minor revolution there. And but I mean, Diane's making the big bucks now, and nobody seems to care, even at well, she's with ABC now, so it gets all blurred. I'm sorry, but I have a lot more support for Mickey and Marjorie going in to run for office than I do with Les Gelb, who I have a lot of professional affection for. I am very disturbed by journalists who go to work in a policy job and then come back through the door, whether it's the New York Times or the Watertown, New York Times. Now, am I being too purist about this? Are we now? I've been hearing the times have changed. Well, why should principles and rules of our game be changed? Can't we find people who want to remain as journalists? And I think the most important thing to ask is, when you leave a job in journalism to go in government, what is your agenda? And then when you leave it to come back to journalism, have you got some altogether new agenda? I mean, I knew, I was just there 4.5 months, I knew who the good reporters were and who the bad reporters were before I went into government. It didn't take 4.5 months at the Justice Department to change my mind on that. So I may be old-fashioned, too purist, but I am disturbed on revolving door policies that allow journalists to be a journalist 1 year and a practitioner, a policymaker the next.
Can I come back on,
Yeah,
come back
sure.
on that? I agree and disagree with what John just said. I think it is a much bigger jump to go from the political side to journalism than to go from the policy side to journalism. We could talk about those cultures, but I think they are different cultures, and you have a decided point of view. There's a political texture and purpose to what you're doing, and someone who's on the policy side of it, I don't think gets involved in those political considerations, for the most part. But I want to agree with the major point that you made, that by and large, I don't think it's good to see people traverse these fields back and forth. And again, reverting to that dinner Bill and I had when I was coming back to the Times, and you were making the case against my coming back, I said, I agree with the principle, because I think it is a very dangerous situation. I thought in my case, I could do it for a variety of reasons. But the principle, I think, you enunciated, John, is a good one. Now, my problem, but for all the reasons you said, my problem comes in terms of the reader or the citizen, getting information out to them. Because in my experience, people in journalism don't understand a lot about what goes on in government. They just don't. The cultures are so profoundly different. You know, what is a reporter? A reporter is somebody the editor sends out and says, go find this out and write about that. And they're out at the end of the string running around as a very independent soul, kind of a single gunslinger. The notion of cooperative behavior for a reporter is almost hilarious. In government, you're in meetings all the time. For a reporter to go to a meeting is like being sentenced to hell. What's a decision? A reporter's decision is to file a story. A decision in government involves compromising very different points of view and mushing them all together. Journalist's job is to deconstruct the mush. The cultures are so profoundly different. It's very hard for most journalists to understand the phenomenon they're reporting on, because looking through that keyhole gives you a very distorted picture. I'll give you one specific example. A common error made in journalism is to assume when there's a meeting in the White House, a decision is made. I would say that happens twice or three times in 100. Decisions don't get made at those meetings. And reporters hear back from people they talk to that a decision got made, and they write it up. I never attended a meeting where there are more than 3 people present where a decision was made. If you've got more than 3 people, you can't have a decision. But the experience of the reporter is not in meetings, so they don't know the dynamic. In fact, when the Times approached me in 1973, and I'd never even been in a junior high school newspaper at that point, and I was a grown boy. I was 36, 37 years old. They approached me to ask me to try being a reporter. Their argument, your argument to me was, you were in government, you know how it works. Come and tell the reader.
Bill, can I add something too?
Sure.
John tried to lay claim to being the skunk at the garden party, and I wanted to compete with him on that.
That's why we have them separated.
That's right.
Get the skunks at either end.
Well, you know, I think there are a couple of considerations, and I don't think that the problem is that you're being old-fashioned. I think the problem is you're not being old-fashioned enough. There was a time, I think there's an underlying assumption here that the difference is between a point of view being proposed and pushed, or an objective evaluation without an agenda attached to it. I think it's been a long time since most news reporters came to coverage of stories in an objective way where they're only job was to gather information, put it out there to the readers, and let them make their own choices. I think one of the things that hurt me when I was in public office, having been a journalist first, certainly hurt some of my relationships with the press, was that I knew these guys. I went to journalism school too. I knew what you studied in journalism. I mean, I knew what information was lacking about their coverage of not only government, but economics, foreign policy, the various things. I knew that they were working for a private enterprise that instead of selling shoes was selling newspapers. And I knew, as Les has pointed out, that they had a great lack of information about what they were purporting to report. But what bothered me even more, you go back to the famous speech by David Brinkley when he proclaimed that objectivity was not really possible for a journalist, and they should stop pretending and stop trying to be objective. And from that, I don't know whether that's what caused it, but from that point forward, I think you can pick up any major daily, including both of them in Boston, and just read the news pages and have no problem identifying point of view. Right. And so I think we undermine the argument a little bit if we start assuming that the choice is between people who have an agenda and people who are value neutral. I don't think that's what the situation really is.
As soon as there are questions, you're welcome to come to the microphones. I'd like to confuse this just a little bit more while we wait for a question or two, but the thing that makes this issue most difficult for me is as a fundamental believer in the notion of free speech, free press, and the press does not belong only to the people who own them. I have difficulty saying this person is designated a journalist and this one's not, even though I don't accept John Sununu as my idea of a journalist. He has opportunity to get on a television network and give information to the people, and that in some ways makes him a journalist. I think he has as much right to express opinion and even offer what he believes to be facts. And I think I have difficulty with that notion that you can say, well, these people are journalists and these people are not, simply because they've been in government or simply because they've never been in government. I think it has more to do with what Mickey just mentioned, whether or not there is an agenda there that's designed to move the consumer of the information in a specific direction, sort of toward a specific conclusion. Right. And that begins to separate things out much more. Well, it
also used to be that journalists prided themselves on being independents. I mean, they would not register as a Democrat or a Republican. They, in a newsroom, often would have a hard time figuring out who was coming from which position, and there was a real attempt at objectivity, despite what David Brinkley said. And I think that we've lost a lot of that, and I think that that is an enormous loss. That's the reason I said that I don't think that I have the right to go back to doing what I was doing before, assuming that, I mean, when I was a journalist, when I first started, I registered as an independent, and tried very hard to be objective, and saved the letters that came in where I knew I was on the absolute opposite side of the issue. And it said, thank you for being so objective. I was so excited that people, or people complaining about me on the side that I was on, figuring that I must be doing something right. But I think we lost a lot of that today.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Carol Gentry. I've been an old-fashioned reporter, newspaper reporter for 20 years. I have a comment and a question. I think my comment is that I think part of the problem is that those we love and those who we would like to admire us often foster this desire for us to be celebrities when all we really want to do is just be reporters. And I come to mind of my mother saying one time, after I had done something she thought was really neat, you keep going this way, maybe you can be like Geraldo. And I was like appalled at the misunderstandings involved with that. But But I wanted to ask Mickey Edwards a question. I heard your really moving piece on NPR either this morning or yesterday about the wetlands in Maine. It was incredibly well written and took a position that I was kind of surprised to hear you take. And I realized afterward that I didn't know where you were coming from because I knew your background. So I didn't know. For those who didn't hear it, he was basically taking on the people in Congress, his Republican former colleagues in Congress, saying that they should not basically be attacking the wetlands the way they are because the wetlands give so much to the human spirit. And what I found myself wondering later is, I wonder how much flack he's going to take from Newt. Is he writing this as a Republican? Is he writing this as a human? Your background as a politician interfered with my ability to appreciate the beauty of what you said. So I wanted to know, first of all, did you write it yourself, number one? And number two, did you take any flack?
Well, it's been too early to take any flack. I think, as all of my press secretaries in Congress knew, I had this unfortunate habit of wanting to write everything myself. And all of us who are journalists won't let anybody else near our words. So, thank you for saying that. I would say, however, that, for those of you who were in my class this afternoon, I apologize for repeating it, but I think perhaps it was not so much a case of you misunderstanding whether I was speaking as a journalist or as a conservative, but of misunderstanding what conservatives believe. In arguing for a very pro-environment, pro-conservation position, I quoted Barry Goldwater. And conscience of a conservative. So, I think it was a consistent conservative position, which I hope some of the conservatives in Washington take note of.
Carol, I don't think he's going to take any flack from Newt because I don't think Newt listens to NPR.
Hi, my name's Tim, and that was sort of a little bit my question. I tend to read a lot of different news sources. I subscribe to the Times and I listen to NPR, and I sometimes read conservative pieces in the Wall Street Journal or the National Review or any number of papers. And I particularly myself enjoy the idea that there are these different well-respected newspapers out there that have different perspectives. So if I want to know what the sort of Northeastern establishment quasi-liberal position is, I read the New York Times, and if I want to know what the more liberal position is, I read the Boston Globe, and if I want to know what the conservative position is, I read the Wall Street Journal or the Manchester Union Leader or something. And for me, I particularly like it, but you all have been taking a very negative position on this. I know that in Europe, generally people identify their politics by what newspaper they read. Oftentimes, if you're a socialist, you read a particular newspaper, and if you walk down the street with the newspaper in your hand, the person will say, he's a socialist. And I wonder if you thought that sort of diversity in viewpoints among the various news establishments might not necessarily be a positive thing if it's understood, if a person who's reading the newspaper understands what the point of view is of the news organization that he or she's reading.
I think it's a great question, but it's an enormous assumption. And yes, I think a lot of the people in this room do. And who are we to say that people aren't? I had two favorite statistics from this last campaign. One was that 1/3, 33% of those people leaving the polling booths thought that George Nethercutt, when he defeated Tom Foley, was going to be Speaker of the House.
They didn't read enough newspapers.
That's an astonishing figure. And I'm sure some of you saw this, but that 27% of those polled when asked if foreign aid was the largest portion of what we spend said yes. So that for those of you who are in your category, you are 100% right. Absolutely. It's lovely to be able to pick up a newspaper and say, this is where I stand, and boy, this is my basket of issues, and I fit right in here. And let me see what they're saying on the other side. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen a lot that way. You know very well that an awful lot of people don't read newspapers at all. that some astonishing figure in the 80s get most of their news from television. So that what you're saying is intellectually very sound, but I'm just not so sure that when we look at the population at large, that we can put a lot of faith in their sources, because once they get it, they think they have it. And I'm not so sure that what they get is all, is true.
Hate to disagree with Marjorie, because she's said the funniest things on this panel so far. But I think what you're saying is the road to perdition. That you're going to do all this triangulating yourself. You're going to read the liberal New York Times and hear the liberal NPR and read a couple articles in Wall Street Journal, and you think that you've calibrated something approximating reality. That's pretty dangerous route to follow. I like it much better when the New York Times was a paper where the whole ethos of the reporters and the editors was you go out and get reliable information so that people can count on it, or you get the most reliable information you can that day, and you fix it the next day. You get more information. I like that much better, because otherwise I have no basis for thinking. I got into the habit with the deterioration, with the end of CBS morning radio news and the deterioration in the New York Times. I got in the habit of reading 6 papers a day, 4 or 5 magazines a week, and all the rest of it, until I decided I'd get a life.
Bill,
But I'm not so sure that wasn't what you were saying. I mean, I don't think that.
He says he can get the truth from reading all these different things. He can figure it out himself.
But you're talking mainly about editorial pages and things like that. You're not talking about the news as is covered in.
He's talking about information, I thought.
You tell us what you're talking about.
I'd rather argue about what he's saying.
I think that there's a distinction to be made between facts and distortion of facts, such as this discussion of whether George Nevertheless is going to become Speaker. Obviously, that's a fact. There's no disagreement about that. What percentage of the budget is the foreign aid budget, and so on. I think, obviously, that if those are distorted for political reasons in any journal, that is the road to perdition. But what facts you think are important to a particular issue are going to be shaped by your belief of how the world works. And I mean, if you were this falls into my second question, which I want to ask, and then I'll sit down, and that is, what do you think would be sort of the quintessential unbiased source of information? And personally, the only thing that I can think of that even comes close to that is the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, because they have the time to really thoroughly explore each position on a particular issue, whereas I find that most other sources don't. And I was just wondering whether you think that that's true, and if there are any other examples that you might think of as being good examples of journalism.
Well, I agree on the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour as being a good program, but I certainly wouldn't single that out. I have to have a crack at the first question, though, since I agree in part with what Les said. Not all newspaper readers can categorize as neatly as you did, this is liberal, this is ultra-liberal, and when you identified the Globe as ultra-liberal, I kind of laughed because, let's see, they endorsed Bill Weld for election the first time around, not exactly an endorsement to win over a lot of liberal friends. That's the editorial page. I think, you're reading those journals from a point of view. Not all readers necessarily do that, and I would hate to see the day that American newspapers tried to get into any sort of competition with the way it's done overseas and have a lot of fact journals out there. I think we deal more in news, and you may not like it, or you may label it a certain way that fits your taste, but I think most readers, that's what they prefer.
I also think that if you get rid of the gaggle of reporters that you have doing what they're doing today, and replace them with another gaggle of reporters, you would find the same complaints in 4 or 5 months anyway. I mean, we come to, or I did, you come to it with baggage. And you're right in saying that you may work the facts in a different way or use certain facts to prove your point and come to the article perhaps with an idea that you're determined to prove. But I still think that it's a system that works in a very unique way, that, and it's frankly much easier to diss than to praise, and there are some really good, strong things about it.
Hi, my name's Dick Kaner. I'm with the Natural Law Party, which is a fairly new entity in the state of Massachusetts and nationally. One of the big issues to us and to me is something that you touched on in the first go-around, which is the difference between government's need to mush together and the journalists' need to pick apart. And the difference between newspapers in terms of their political orientation, I think, is less pronounced now than it was 20 or 30 years ago when I was in college. And what they've become now is really a bunch of performers. I'm sorry to say it, but I can remember in January, Ed Siegel wrote a piece in the Globe looking at the coverage of Newt Gingrich's meeting with Bill Clinton. And he looked at how the major networks covered it. ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, all four of those, looked at all of the potentially divisive issues, decisions that came up in that meeting. The only difference from that was C-SPAN's reporting, which obviously it isn't reporting, it's just transmitting, it's facts. So I'm wondering, in looking at this revolving door issue of journalism and politics, it seems that that issue of picking apart versus mushing together is really an issue that needs to be looked at more carefully, both by government and by the press. Do we want to work to build consensus? Do we want to work to educate the people making decisions and the people living with the decisions? Or do we want to simply entertain? We can entertain more by picking apart.
One of the things that you said is interesting, and what it sparked for me was a reality that I can remember talking to a friend of mine who was a really, and is a fine newspaper reporter who does a lot of commentary, is on television a lot doing that. And what has happened to his life is that he relies for income now much, much, much more on his television appearances. The modest salary that one earns, and that used to be one's complete living, has now translated quite dramatically into these quite enormous salaries in some cases, so that young reporters in newspapers now aspire to that venue. And it does change the nature of the business quite dramatically. That's not an answer to your question, but when you were when you were saying that, one of the things that I wanted to add.
You know, as you asked that question, I think I would break it down even a little differently. I think the entertainment part of it is very real. I think, Marjorie, it's more than just the fact that people are getting additional money becoming celebrities instead of just reporters. I think that's part of it. I think part of it is the fact that television puts you in a time frame where you don't have the space or time to work with that you have in print media. So that drives broadcast journalism in this direction of what's entertaining, what has a picture with it, and so forth. But I think that's letting my favorite media, the print, off a little bit too easily, because you watch a presidential campaign, and certainly a president, who wins a presidency is very important to the destiny of the nation. You watch a presidential campaign, and even in the newspapers, you have a very hard time finding out what either candidate really believes. You can find out how many people protested at the rally. You can find out what the latest poll showed about who's ahead in South Dakota. But in terms of actually getting factual information about which candidate said what, It is very difficult to do, and that's true in print as well as in broadcast. I don't know if you put that in your category of entertainment rather than news reporting, but it's a trivialization of the news that I think makes it harder for the electorate to make rational judgments.
Just,
The-
could I, go ahead, Nikki, I'm sorry. That's just one little addition. You mentioned about coalition building rather than mushing. Well, the newspapers or reporters aren't interested in coalition building. That's Clinton's job and Gingrich's job. And we're there to report. I don't see our role as, helping one side or the other to coalition build. And you said the network's handling it differently. You said CNN was just fact. Well,
No,
CNN,
C-SPAN.
C-SPAN, okay. But CNN is something of a conveyor belt. I mean, it's a rush to get out, and here's the event with no interpretation on it. And the networks do that, although they haven't been doing it very much since Gingrich has all the attention these days. But that coalition building bothered me a little bit that you mentioned.
Well, I'd like to hear what this natural law party is, but I'm afraid it would take too long for you to tell me. There's a question behind your question, and behind a lot of things we're saying, is who we're writing for. The people who taught me American politics here, like V.O. Key, used to say the American people don't know nothing, but they ain't dumb. And I think it's just true. Any poll we've ever had asking what information Americans have in their head will only depress you. But if you ask people what's sort of commonsensical to do, what's working and not, they're pretty good at it. And it's a rock bottom basis for democracy. But you've got to give them the basis for making that choice. And that is essentially the responsibility of the press. It's an enormous load to bear for the press. And I don't think you do it simply by giving people opinions. You got to give them some information. Those who will take it, but it has a spreading effect. It smells up other stuff. It's good information. And one of the things that troubles everyone who has grown up in American journalism to the last 10 years or so is the fact that there's very little in the papers you can count on. That even the best newspapers now, in effect, run editorials on the front page. And at that point, it becomes very difficult for Americans to use that native good sense.
Just one quick word on another point we need to get across the room. Your point about the journalistic penchant to focus on the conflict. The story is all built on the conflict. That's a story construct that's been with us for 50 years, but there is a strong movement now in journalism to re-examine that whole question and try to find different ways to write stories that begin to focus more at the top of the story on the kind of information you're talking about that helps consumers out there see a broader purpose to the story than simply conflict. It's running headlong into this editorialization and writing with an attitude that's also coming across the scene. But it's a struggle that I think enough people are engaged in now that there'll be some change in that point. Yeah, Tara.
I'm Tara Murphy. I'm a first-year student here at the Kennedy School. And I guess I'd like to go back to the first question that Bill raised earlier. Where does all of this leave the electorate? And in particular, how does it play out in terms of their cynicism about the press as an institution and government? When I was telling people about organizing this forum and talking about spin versus journalism, a number of people said, well, what do you mean there really isn't a difference anymore? People were kind of incredulous that we were still talking about the idea of objective journalism. And I wanted to get some of your perspectives on that.
Well, can I make one comment? Because I'm, as you know from this fall, I'm a little upset and disturbed about, I finally accept the word, I didn't want to accept the word, the cynicism of students at this university on issues like that. And it bothers me that a lot of what I think is seen as spin and editorialization and so forth, I think is very deeply embedded in the mind or eyes of the beholder. I mean, there are a lot of stories on the front page of the newspaper you can read today, and you're going to see a spin, and I'm going to see it's fairly straightforward. And I'm not sure the journalism is at fault. I think we're developing an attitude, and have maybe for a decade or more in this country, that what we read has to agree with what we think, that we don't read stories so much for information as we're searching for agreement to what we already think. And if the story doesn't do that, then it becomes spin. And I think of what I would consider almost a case study of a straight, powerful story, which happens to be foreign, I mean, an international story, not local, but I think it would make the point. Yesterday in the New York Times, inside, Roger Cohen had a piece about a UN peacekeeper who died in Sarajevo, and it was a powerful description of this 19-year-old kid with the television cameras on his face as the life went out of his eyes. And I thought that was about as good a piece of journalism as I read, until I mentioned it to somebody who thought the Serbs were being mistreated by the press. And that reader thought it was a terrible editorial, that it was the whole point of the story was to make the Serbs look bad. And almost any story you read now, you can find an argument with someone next door who reads the same story and totally disagrees with your take or my take on whether or not the story is an effort, if not to be totally objective, to at least have an objective relationship with the consumer of the information, try to give them as much real information as the reporter can. So I'm not sure the criticism is completely accurate. That's
Well, I think that I would agree with you, Bill, on the word of cynicism. I think that has grown through the years as a charge leveled at reporters and editors that's not altogether true. We are all, as reporters, spun every day, and you try to, I mean, reporting is a common sense job, and you know if somebody's trying to influence what you're going to put in the paper or what you're going to give to an editor that eventually gets into the paper. In political campaigns, Mickey alluded to this earlier because I'm most familiar with the charges that come out of that. I was always fascinated when I was political editor at U.S. News. People would say when you were out, why do you keep just talking about the horse race? Who's ahead? Who's behind? Why don't you do something about issues? And I think every week we would run from Labor Day to the election a page-to-page facing page on the stand of the candidates, presidential candidates, on the issues the worst read of anything we had to offer, because the same people that are complaining about it never read it. And so how are you going to, I mean, so it partly becomes our charge, how are you going to package this in a different way that it has a little razzmatazz in it that'll draw people in to read it. And that becomes a real challenge, and why I've always bristled when I hear people say, oh, you're not covering the issues. We cover the hell out of the issues, but people don't read it.
Well, let me raise a question about that. I wonder, sometimes I wonder, as Bill mentioned, my degree is in journalism. I taught journalism in college. Very proud of my background in journalism. Sometimes I think journalists forget what their mission is in life. If the obligation of that publication was to present information about the unfolding of the campaign and the positions of the candidates, I'm not sure that I completely agree that it should matter that much to you whether or not as many people read it as you would have liked to have read it, unless business is driving it more than the obligation of the press to provide information. That's one of the things that concerns me, and as some people around here know, this is a slightly different thing, but it has to do with a little bit of the difference between American papers and European. We have a different standard for the press here. It's a protected press, protected constitutionally. And at times I think the press gets a little casual with the news because it misinterprets the First Amendment, which to believe that the First Amendment is designed to protect the press. I don't, I'm also an attorney, and I don't think it does. I think the First Amendment is designed to protect the right of the public to be properly informed about what its government is doing. And if that's the purpose of the First Amendment, it changes a little bit the responsibility of the press in terms of where it puts its priorities. So, I do know, I understand the frustration of running stuff that people aren't reading. I used to write stuff all the time that nobody read. Maybe that's why they didn't read it. But, I do think that it doesn't relieve the press of the obligation to report what's being said by the candidates in the rallies and so forth, and, hope that at least enough people read it to have an effect.
Yeah.
My name is Bill Fox. I'm a fellow at the Shorenstein Center. And had I, as a former political reporter who became a press secretary, had I been at the dinner with Mr. Gelb and Mr. Kovach, I would have most emphatically been on Mr. Kovach's side of the discussion, and would be today. But I must say, based on some of the reading about journalism and reading of the journalism since I've been here as a fellow, I'm beginning to wonder why, and why I'd still have that view. And I'd like to pursue two ideas in that context with you. First of all, I'm intrigued at the notion that there's an exemption for policy people, because I would have thought that the policy development process was connected to the political agenda of the administration of the day. And so I think that may be an artificial distinction with respect.
What I was suggesting is it's more analytical than it is the political interest of people or a party. Okay. But you may not accept it, but that's what I was suggesting.
I also think there's actually another way for journalists to recross the river Styx, and that is if you do a kind of a charged up prodigal son routine and denounce everything you did on that side, everybody you met, and everything that you ever was involved in. And that too intrigues me, because if you thought it was a reasonable thing to do in the first instance, I don't know why you'd denounce it after the fact. But the 2 points I wanted to pursue were the emergence of sort of star or celebrity journalism, because it seems to me that is a root cause of a lot of our concerns. When we move away from a premium on factual reporting and assign that premium to personality, which most often finds expression on television or on radio, that we've moved away from what political journalism started out to do. And the second thing I'd like to ask your thoughts about is sort of the attitudes of the news organizations themselves to this phenomenon of revolving door. I mean, they clearly, if they choose to hire a columnist, say a Chris Matthews, and run his work next to Jules Witkover's, they've come to a determination that there is a value about that. And I would be interested in your thoughts on that.
Boy, let me jump in first. Well, if I was an editor and I had those two columnists, Witkover's goes and in the paper and Matthews doesn't. But Chris Matthews served for years as Tip O'Neill's press secretary, and he works now for a San Francisco newspaper, and I hate to get personal about this. Chris is a nice guy, but he spends all his time on television. I don't know how he can have time to write anything for the San Francisco paper, because he's commentating on CBS and saying things on NBC. And I don't read the San Francisco paper, but by God, he doesn't have much time to report for them. And I think you're right, Bill. I think the news organizations are tussling with this right now. And it won't be tomorrow, and it probably won't be this year, but I think you are going to see some newer and harder rules that some people in our fraternity aren't going to like. Maybe that won't happen. Maybe I'm altogether wrong, or I'm being hopeful about it, but I hope it happens.
Hi, my name is John Simon. I'm a master's student here at the Kennedy School. A lot of the comments of the panel seem to indicate that there was once a golden age of journalism when journalists were objective, and that we've moved away from that somewhat. I'm just wondering if that is an age that can be demarcated in any way. Because it seems if you go far back enough, you have the William Randolph Hearsts and the Horace Greeleys and very, very political newspapers. And I'm also wondering if, when you had those very political newspapers, if you may not have also had sharper discussion in the news. That is, Greeley's, I believe it was New York Herald, used to debate the New York Times, and the Chicago papers used to be able to debate, and there was, it seemed, maybe a little bit more substantive discussion of all that isn't fact. And it seems to me a lot of truth is made up of a lot which isn't fact, and that it wouldn't be such a bad thing to have more discussions of the things that aren't fact in the newspaper, but it would be giving up a lot of that objectivity.
Well, let me make one observation about it, John. I'm not sure that it addresses a line of demarcation, but one of the things that has changed is during those days, if the Sun and the Herald and the Times and the Post and the papers in New York, or the Tribune and the American and the Sun Times papers in Chicago, and all, there were multiple newspapers in most major cities, and that kind of a dialogue might in fact take place. I still am not in favor of that being an excuse to not have objective reporting in your news columns. But the fact is, today it's almost irrelevant because there are very few cities, Boston one of the few left, that have more than one major daily newspaper. And that means that for most people in the country, they are getting news from one newspaper alone, and they don't have that debate going on. So that's something that has significantly changed the effect of having a partisan news page.
And your question is really fair, because anytime you get people over 50 sitting down telling you about the way things were, it was always better when they were doing it. And I can understand that.
The good old days shift.
One more competitive town bit the dust today, Mickey, the Houston Post folded. So there's only one Houston paper.
Can I just go on with that for one more moment?
Okay, we're going to have time
30
for
seconds.
just one more question. I apologize to the rest of you standing, but this will be the last question here after.
I forgot what I was going to say.
Speaking of the good old days.
Would you take the last question, please? I hope those of you who are standing can stay around after we adjourn. I'm sure some of the panelists will talk further.
My name is John Lloyd. I was for 4 years bureau chief in Moscow for the Financial Times. I'm now a visiting fellow at the Kennedy School. It's a comment really, and it's from a European perspective. I mean, I found as often when I discuss things with American colleagues or hear them speak, that there is, although we do, contrary to some of the comments this evening, we do report the news in Europe. So we are.
Is that an opinion or a fact?
But there is a gulf between us, and partly I think one of my colleagues, the first lady who spoke, made it clear that there is a star system in America, which is quite different from Europe. That is, it's been clear to me for the last 10 or 20 years that the position of the reporter in America is seen as an honored one. It isn't that really in Europe. It's become a little better recently, but reporters are still somewhat below the salt, no doubt, at the reflection of our notorious class system. Here, reporters, to say one is a reporter is an honored title. In Britain and elsewhere in the European continent, to say you're a reporter, you wouldn't say it everywhere. You say it some places. I also don't have all that much problem, and we do come from different cultures, newspaper cultures, in the revolving door. As long as it's labeled, and it should be labeled, I see more of a problem, in a sense, in intellectual mindsets among reporters. Just two or three brief examples. I come from Scotland. I haven't worked as a reporter in Scotland since my youth, but now Scottish reporters and columnists and editors, and there still is an independent press in Scotland, unlike elsewhere in the UK. A press which is still a non-metropolitan, non-London press, which is a separate existence. No reporter, no columnist, no editor in Scotland could be other than either nationalist, like for Scots nationalism, or for a fairly radical devolution of power. Yet there is at least 30% of people in Scotland who don't believe that. They aren't served. There was the intellectual mindset of reporters, none of whom have been through the revolving door, very, very few, is such that to write a piece which would be a powerful statement of unionism, that the UK should be a unitary state, which it has been for the last 200 or 300 years, would simply not be intellectually justifiable. You would have a few cranky Tories perhaps coming in a very late, this is his opinion only, not that of the papers, but for a reporter or for a columnist simply isn't given. And that, I think, that kind of intellectual mindset which grips reporters, I mean, that's one particular example. At the moment in Britain as a whole, it is a matter of faith that the next Prime Minister will be the new leader of the Labour Party, Tony Blair. He has got the intellectual, if you like, wave in his favour, and no one seriously takes it on, apart from if Rupert Murdoch tells one of his editors to go on the attack. One last word, I mean, we're running out of time, but I agreed very much with the last speaker about the golden age, not just because the panel are over 50, but I was in the New York Times office in Moscow just before coming here with my colleague Steve Erlanger, who's the bureau chief now, and on the walls of the New York Times Moscow office are front pages from the New York Times, which have the death of previous general secretaries of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And the first one was Lenin, and the story was by Walter Duranty, which some of you will remember. And Duranty was the reporter throughout the 20s and I think the 30s for the New York Times, as they say, a distinguished foreign correspondent who was as soft on Stalin as you could get without being a member of the Politburo. The death of Lenin was seen as a tragedy, an absolute national but also international tragedy. The death of Stalin, which was not, thank God, Duranty, was also seen as the death of a great man. The death of Brezhnev was a bit better. In short, the stories got better. As you went through to the present day, to the ending of Gorbachev, not, thank God, his death yet, you got fuller coverage, you got more diverse coverage, it was from more different angles, and it was at least an attempt to write a first draft of history, which is what we're enjoined to do, with some sense that the intellectual tyranny of the times should be cut against. So I'm less concerned with revolving doors as with fixed opinions.
Great statement. That would be a good point to close on. I'd like to make 2 points, if I might. One is to complete the Les Gelb story, because, Bill, I started that dinner in that frame of mind, and he turned me around. And at the end of his first year, he convinced me that it was the person more than the history that should count. And one of the agreements we made was that he would not write on any policy which he had a hand in constructing until we agreed, and he didn't write for a year. The first piece he wrote at the end of a year was a magazine piece which I vetted before it went up, and it justified
On arms control.
it justified the decision because it had an insight for me and for everybody else who read it that we would have missed had it not been written by someone who understood arms control from his perspective. And the point was, there is no arms control policy in the United States. Arms control is simply a metaphor for U.S.-Soviet relations. And if you began to look at arms control through that lens, which everybody who read the New York Times did, arms control discussions they were entirely different. You understood them entirely differently. So I think the point there is just what the gentleman said, is that it really has more to do with the individual rather than the specific history. But I think what we've learned tonight, Tara, is that anytime you get some journalists together and pose any question whatsoever, it's like pulling a string on a thread, the whole damn thing unravels. But I want to please join me in thanking our guests tonight on the panel. We kept you from the press conference. No.
Yeah. I'll give you my, oh, I haven't got my card.